Hi folks, it's Rob from the Bush and Boltgun. Today I'm going to be doing a short tutorial on how to paint a Black Legion Terminator. So we're going to start off with Citadel Liberator Gold as the first of the metallics. It's going to be used to do all of his armour trim and the decorations on his Boltgun. I'll try and get quite a smooth layer of this. If there's a few streaks it doesn't matter too much, but you want to try and get it as smooth as you can. We'll keep going with this layer, and then when we come back, we'll be on to the next one. Next we're going to be using Citadel Leadbelcher. It's going to be used to do the trophy spikes, some of the tubing, the chainmail, and a few of the smaller details on his mask. We'll keep going with this, come back onto the next layer. Now we're going to be using Vallejo Modeler Chrome. This is just to do a few of the smaller details, like the skull on his sword, where we want a really good shine on that. Like so. Now we're going to Citadel Retributor Armour. Again, this is just to do a few of the smaller details. Like so. Now we're just going to paint his skin with Vallejo Flesh Base. There's only a little bit on this guy, so it shouldn't take too long. Like so. Now we're moving on to Citadel Rakarth Flesh. This is going to be to do some of the little claws and the skulls on his trophy spikes, and the horns coming out the top of his armour. We'll get these finished and then come back for the next layer. Next up is Citadel Mephiston Red. I'm going to be using this to do all the reds, so his loincloth, a couple of the rounds on his Boltgun there, so they look like tracer, and also the tuft of hair that's knotted next to his leg. We're also going to be doing the lenses on the helmet at the back, because that's going to be done as a Black Templar's helm. Like so. Next up, we're going to be using Citadel Xereus Purple. Now this is just a personal choice on a power sword. I've got Sons of Horus for Warhammer 30k, and so with their power weapons I've done all them with purple blades, so I'm just continuing that on with the Black Legion. Like so. Next up, we're going to be going on to the shades. The first one we're using is a Xereus shade. I'm going to use this on all the golds. You do want quite a thick layer on the gold, not too much that when it dries shiny. If need be, you can do 2 layers of this, just to darken up the shade. Just make sure that the first layer is dry when you apply the second layer, otherwise it can wipe some of it away. Next we're going to be using Citadel Nuln Oil. I'm going to be using this to do all the silver metallics. I was going to be going over the last layer of a Xereus shade on the gold, just to darken them up a little bit more, so it gives it a more dirty and grubby look. Like so. Now we're going to use some Seraphim Sepia. I'm going to use this on all of the bones and the little teeth or claws that are growing out of his armour. Like so. Now going on to Citadel Violet. We're just going to use this on all of the reds. So the handle of his sword, tuft of hair here and at the back, and also the loincloth on the front. Like so. Now going on to Citadel Reichland Flesh Shade, a really quick layer. We're just going to do his face. Like so. Now just going to return to the base colours. I'm going to start by using Citadel Retributor Armour. I'm going to use this just to do all the previous areas we use Retributor Armour and bring a shine to all the top edges of them where they'd be catching the light. Like so. Next we'll be using Citadel Liberator Gold, just to bring all the colours back to that gold. We're also going to highlight the Retributor armour with this colour as well. I can see where they've worked it around the neck piece there. They've tried to kind of feather that into the edges where the shade joins the gold, just so it doesn't have too much of a sharp edge between it. You don't just want a straight line where the gold is joined onto the shade, you just sort of try and soften that a little bit. Next I'm going to be using a little bit of Modeler Chrome mixed with Liberator Gold, just to give it a really shiny highlight on the golds. I just want to be using this on the top edges and the areas that will be catching the light to give them a really good shine. We'll have this layer finished when we come back and move on to the next. So the next layer is going to be Citadel Leadbelcher. So we're going to bring a bit more of a shine back to the metallics that we've used on his Boltgun, his chainmail and the trophy spikes at the top. Apologies, we're a little bit off camera there. When we come back, we'll have all this layer finished. Next up, we're just going to be using straight model air chrome. This just to put a little bit of a shiny edge onto the edges of the trophy spikes, also to do the skull on his sword, just to add a little bit of a shine to some of the other metallics. Like so. Now we're going to go back to Citadel Flesh Base and start working on his face. It's a lot thinner than the medium layer brush from Citadel that I used to paint most of the rest of the stuff. It means that you can get some nice little details in there. There's a few little lumpy bits on the front of his skull there. It'd be sort of just on the right hand side of his forehead. But I wasn't too sure what it was meant to be, so a little bit later I'll just use a bit of shade on that to make it a bit red. Next we're going to add a little bit of white to the Vallejo flesh base. I'm going to start adding highlights to his skin. Now again, you only want to be adding the highlights to the top edges, where it'd be catching the light. You don't want to be adding highlights to the underside of anything. Like so. Now we're just going to use a little bit of more Vallejo White in the mix. I'm going to do one final highlight on his skin. Now just trying to get the very raised edges and the highest points on the details highlighted here. Next up, we're moving on to Citadel Rakarth Flesh. I'm going to start reapplying the colour back on the bone. Like so. Now we've just added a little bit of Citadel Ushabti bone to the Rakarth flesh. I'm going to start doing one highlight on these. So on these parts you just want to be trying to do the middle of them, or the front of them, depending on where you want the light coming from. A little bit out of focus there, unfortunately. And when you're painting the skulls, you want to be painting the areas where the light's going to catch it. So the top edges of things are going to catch more light than the bottom edges. Next we're going to add a little bit of Vallejo White to the mix. I'm going to highlight these skulls a little bit more. Like so. Now we're just going to be using a little bit of Citadel Mephiston Red. I'm going to reapply the colour back to the loincloth and the tuft of hair on his side, and also the handle of his sword. You're just going to make sure that you leave some of the Druchii Violet in the recesses there, so you're highlighting the raised areas and the areas that catch the light more. like so. Next we're going to add a little bit of Citadel Fire Dragon Bright to the Mephiston Red. I'm going to do highlights on the cloth, on its raised areas, with a couple of layers of this, getting lighter and lighter with a little bit more Fire Dragon Bright. You can get the loincloths looking really, really good. It doesn't take too much effort either, which is quite good. When we come back, we'll have all of this mix finished. Going to add a little bit more Fire Dragon Bright to the previous mix, just to lighten that up a bit. Now we're just really going for the extreme highlights on this. Now we're going to use a little bit of Vallejo White and add that to some Mephiston Red, just make a nice pinkish kind of colour. I'm going to start highlighting the lenses on the helmet and the trophy spikes there. Like so. Now we're going to add a little bit more Vallejo White and do a further highlight on the lens. Add a little bit more white once more. Add one final highlight and a little dot to each lens. Sorry about that, they are just out of shot there. Now I'm just going to use some Vallejo White just to do his eyes. I just find it easier to go side to side with this, but using the brush vertically. So from the inside of the eye to the outside of the eye, dragging the brush flat across that way. Now we're just going to use a little bit of Vallejo Black to do the pupils on his eyes, and then start reapplying the black to his armour. Once you start reapplying the black to his armour, it does start to come together and look a lot more finished. Looks a little bit less shabby where the other colours have gone onto it. Now we're going to be using some Vallejo German Grey to highlight the black. Now you do want to be applying the German Grey to the areas which would be catching the light if it was coming down from above. So any exposed panels like that that are sticking out, you want to be putting more grey on them than maybe the side of them, the underside of them. When we come back, we'll have all of the German Grey finished. Move on to the next colour. Now we're going to be using a little bit of Citadel Mechanicus Standard Grey mixed in with the German Grey. I'm going to start applying a highlight to the edges of the areas where we've just put the German Grey now. Like so. So we've added another load of Citadel Mechanicus Standard Grey to the previous mix, and we're just going to do one final highlight. Now this mix is only a little tiny bit darker than just the Mechanicus Standard Grey on its own. So we're just going to use this to highlight some little edges that will be catching the light. like so. Now we're starting to work on his sword, so we're going to return to Citadel Xereus Purple. This is the same base colour we used at the very start. Just going to apply this to the edges, to the blade, and a little bit down the base of it as well. Now this we're going to be using just Xereus Purple and White to build up a few layers to make it a bit smoother, going from purple to white. Now we've added some white to the Xereus Purple. Not too much, just enough to lighten it up a little bit. And we're going to reapply this layer just like a millimetre shy of where you've applied the previous layer, so that you can still see some of that previous layer there. Like so. Now we've added more white to the mix, and we're going to do exactly the same again. And again we're going to leave the previous layer visible for maybe like a millimetre or so, and then apply this mix. What you should start seeing is a slight gradient from the purple to the shade that you're currently using. I'm just going to use a few more layers to build that up, to get that up to white. Now you can do far more layers if you want to smooth that out. So we've added more white to the previous mix once more. I'm going to do exactly the same again. As I was saying, you can do more layers and more layers, however you want to do it, to get that really, really smooth. Like the transition from the purple to the white. The smoother it is, the better it looks, but for a tabletop miniature, I'm not going to spend that long doing layers and layers and layers and layers to get them up to a really, really high standard. I just want them to look good for when you're playing. Now we're adding a little bit more white to the previous mix. We're doing exactly the same again, leaving the previous layers showing, and adding this mix to the very top of those areas. Like so. Once more, adding more white to the previous mix. Can do exactly the same again. You can see that we're getting close to the very tip of the blade, and the very tip of those bits, and the very base of the sword there. Like so. Now we're adding a little bit more white to that previous mix once more. It's probably one of the final layers, if not the final layer. Like so. Now we're just going to use pure Vallejo White to do the final tips on the blade. So we're also going to do the very edges of the blade as well. So you just get a little bit of white paint on the brush, and then you basically drag it side to side. Now you might have to play around with the angle a bit to get it right, but you're basically just lining the very edge of the blade with a little bit of paint just to give it that white light. Like so. And finally on the blade we're going to use a little bit of Citadel Violet just to darken up the very extreme areas where the purple is still showing. That just gives you that kind of extra gradient from the light to the very, very dark purple. If you want to see a tutorial on doing this just on its own, a bit more detail and a bit more slow time, let me know. I'll get one of them done up for us. Next up, we're going to be using Citadel Seraphim Sepia. We're going to start working on the barrel of the melter gun. So you want to be doing like maybe the first mill at the base of the barrel with the Seraphim Sepia. And because it's such a small part going in front of the camera, it does drop off and on a little bit here, but you can still see exactly what's happening. Next, we're going to use a little bit of Citadel Casandora Yellow. I'm going to do about a mil of Casandora Yellow right on the edge of the Seraphim Sepia. Now if you're applying one shade while the previous one is still a little bit wet, you will get a little bit of mix in there, and it does look quite good when you're doing these kind of barrels, so it doesn't matter too much if it's still a little bit wet on the previous one. Next up, we're going to add a little bit of Citadel Fugan Orange and do exactly the same, just around a mil next to the Casandora Yellow mill. Next we're moving on to Citadel Carroburg Crimson. I'm going to do another mill next to the Fugan Orange. Like so. Now going on to Citadel Druchii Violet shade. I'm going to do exactly the same once more. It's going to be another mill of this colour just around the Carroburg Crimson. Like so. Next it's Drakenhof Nightshade. This is going to be right next to the Druchii Violet. Which joins on nicely to the next shade, which is going to be the final shade on the barrel, and it's Citadel Nuln Oil. It's just to give the very end of the barrel a kind of charred look. Like so. Now we're going to add a little bit of redness to his eyes using Citadel Carroburg Crimson. He's just going to be doing the underneath and the top of his eyes. Like so. Just going to add the little tiny bits of this lumpy bit at the top here. I've added a little bit too much, so you can just wet the brush and get rid of a little bit of that just to calm the colour down. Now we're moving on to his Legion badge, so we're going to start with Vallejo White, and you can see where I've drawn on the Eye of Horus roughly on his shoulder pad there. So I'm using a medium layer brush just to get the general shape of that on, and then once we've got the general shape of it on, we'll then use a thinner brush, a little bit of black and a little bit of German grey, just to smooth out those edges and get the arrows looking a bit better. I always use a medium layer brush to get the general shape of it on the armour, so that you can see what you're working with. Next up we're going to use a little bit of Citadel Carroburg Crimson. We're just going to wash the entire Eye of Horus with that. Like so. Now we're going to use Citadel Fugan Orange. I'm going to use that for the top half of the Eye of Horus. Like so. And last but not least, we're now going to use some Citadel Carroburg Crimson just to add the final colour to the shoulder pad, and that's to do about the top quarter of it. Now I do the top of the arrows which go out on the sides as well, so it's sort of like a bit of a crescent at the top that I like to do with this red, like so. And that is the finished Black Legion Terminator. Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and if you have, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future content. Also think about subscribing to some of our other social media linked below. Thanks very much.